Hey folks, and welcome to our second video on Surrealist cinema. In this video, we're going to be spending a lot more time with a particular film, perhaps the most famous Surrealist film, Un Chien Andalou. In the last video, we looked at some historical conditions of Surrealism that emerged in the 1920s, as well as some major aesthetic characteristics of Surrealism. And we ended by looking at some of the reasons why the Surrealists were drawn to cinema as a medium. But we didn't quite look closely at actual Surrealist films. So we're going to do that today. We're going to look closely at this film called Un Chien Andalou, in English, An Andalusian Dog, by Bunuel and Salvador Dali. We talked about Surrealist artist Salvador Dali in the last video. Bunuel, however, is a Spanish filmmaker, and perhaps he's the best known filmmaker associated with Surrealism. Keep in mind that while this film is generally attributed to both artists, Dali and Bunuel, in film history, we generally give a little bit more heft to Bunuel as the author of this film, though it is, of course, still a collaboration. So I think the first thing we might note about the film is that the screenplay was based on two dreams of its creators, Bunuel and Dali. Remember how we talked about in the last video how Surrealism can be understood as a way of approaching art as much as a set of characteristics we might identify in a particular work of art. And incorporating elements of one's dreams was something that a lot of Surrealist artists did. So Bunuel and Dali got together and they each had these images that they found from their own dreams in which they wanted to incorporate into the film. Bunuel said he had a dream of a cloud slicing the moon like, quote, a razor blade slicing through an eye. And Dali said he had a dream of a hand crawling with ants. Keep in mind, of course, that ants were a common motif in a lot of Dali's paintings, and we can see them in the famous painting that he would make a couple of years later, A Persistence of Memory. So I think it's pretty important to note that this film did not emerge from a concrete storyline, but rather from strange images. The second thing that I think is really important to understand about this film is that it is relatively plotless, but it is anti-narrative rather than non-narrative. So first, I just want to acknowledge the relationship between Surrealist artists and conventional narrative, especially the conventional narratives of films. André Breton has this wonderful anecdote where he talks about his own practices of watching movies. This is what he says. He says, I used to drop into the cinema when whatever was playing at any point in the show and leaving at the first hint of boredom to rush off to another cinema where we behaved the same way. I have never known anything so magnetizing. So André Breton, being the author of the Surrealist Manifesto, has this practice where he likes to go to the movies, but he doesn't like to stay for the entire film. In other words, he likes to impose his own interest onto a film and deny the film's demand that it be understood as a complete story. He seems to be attracted to images. And he seems to also like to create his own juxtapositions between one image and another by literally leaving the theater portraying one film and enter another exhibiting a different film. That, I think, gives you a little hint at the relationship between Surrealism and conventional cinematic narrative. But now I want to be more precise about what I mean about the difference between anti-narrative and non-narrative. David Bordwell and Kristen Thompson talk about this in their gloss on Surrealist film. They say Hollywood filmmakers, the Expressionists, and the Impressionists were all committed to storytelling, even if their methods differed. But Surrealist cinema was anti-narrative, attacking causality and coherence. So let's try to figure out what Bordwell and Thompson are saying here. By Expressionism and Impressionism, they're referring to two contemporaneous avant-garde film movements happening at the same time in the 1920s. They're talking about these film movements in Europe that pushed against the conventions of Hollywood cinematic storytelling. But the point that Bordwell is making is that even though the French Impressionist filmmakers and the German Expressionist filmmakers were pushing boundaries, they were still telling stories. The Impressionists would push boundaries in terms of camera effects, which they would use to render the subjective experience of their characters. The German Expressionists would push boundaries of mise-en-scène, which they would also use to render the subjective experience of characters, right? So we might say that on the other side of avant-garde film, which Bordwell doesn't talk about, we have filmmakers who avoid narrative altogether. We have another film movement in France in the 19-teens and 20s, sometimes called cinema pur or pure cinema. We have a similar movement in Germany in the teens and 20s called absolute film. And we have Dadaist film associated with the Dada movement, all of which are not giving us narratives at all, but are giving us a series of abstract images. or rather, a series of images that relate to each other not by means of cause and effect in a narrative chain. Somewhere in the middle, we have surrealist cinema. Surrealist cinema is not as non-narrative as pure cinema or absolute cinema, but it's certainly not as narrative as impressionist and expressionist cinema. And figuring out the relationship between surrealist cinema and narrative, I think, is really important to understanding what surrealist cinema is. And one reason this is really important is because Luis Bunuel was not only trying to make a film that was pushing against Hollywood, he was equally interested in making a film that was pushing against the other avant-garde filmmakers at the time. He looked at these abstract films and he said, "I hate this stuff." He didn't actually say, "I hate this stuff." This is what he said. He said, "Un Chien Andalou is a violent reaction against avant-garde cinema, which was directed exclusively to the artistic sensibility and to the reason of the spectator, with its play of light and shadow, its photographic effects, its preoccupation with rhythmic montage." In other words, while Bunuel was certainly against Hollywood film, the major conventions of storytelling established in the United States, he also thought that the options for going against Hollywood norms were a bit too respectable. They still presumed a certain value in the quote-unquote artistic. They were fancy, elevated. They kind of shied away from the dark and visceral aspects of the human unconscious. In a sense, they sort of hid behind their photographic effects, their plays of light and shadow, not giving us a raw picture of the sometimes violent and sexual motives that dwells in the unconscious mind. So once again, let's get back to that idea of surrealist cinema being not non-narrative and not a subjective narration that kind of goes into the mind of a character but then comes back out, but rather anti-narrative. So to be anti-narrative, you first need to give us something that looks like scenes and characters. And the film Un Chien Andalou does do that. Indeed, the film gives us a kind of prologue that seems to occur outside time, but then we get a somewhat stable set of characters and places. We start with a man on a bicycle. We get intercuts with a woman in her apartment. We quickly see that the woman can see the man from her window in the apartment. The man falls on his bicycle and she comes down to care for him. And then soon after, he finds herself in her apartment. We do have something that resembles characters, and we do have something that resembles scenes, which was not seen in a lot of the non-narrative films of cinema pure and absolute film. And you might even say that when you look at the film overall, there's a kind of general conflict and a general resolution. One of the major actions of the film, if not the major action of the film, is that the man sexually molests the woman. He assaults her, and she retreats. Near the end of the film, she escapes from him, exits her apartment, finds herself on a beach, finds a new man, and they embrace and kiss. So only when we compare this film to actual non-narrative films do we see the relationship between this film and conventional narrative. It's this relationship that grants the film something that we might call anti-narrative rather than non-narrative. Now let me show you what that looks like. So a simple example is something like the film's deliberately disjointed chronology. There are many ways in which the film has a parodic or ridiculing relationship to the conventions of storytelling, especially cinematic storytelling. You can see that pretty clearly in its use of these intertitles that give us chronological markers. 8 years later, around 3 a.m, 16 years before, in the spring. These kinds of titles are usually used in Hollywood film or narrative film to show a clear causal relationship between something that came before and something that came after. But in this film, it's almost impossible to see any concrete causal relationship between the things that happened before the titles and the things that happened after. We get the same sort of ridiculing effect with this first title that says Once Upon a Time, which we might associate with the narrative simplicity of a fairy tale, but more generally something that tells us, okay, we are entering a story. So what are the ways in which this film attacks narrative or makes itself anti-narrative? I think a key word here is causality. Wardwell and Thompson say, but surrealist cinema was anti-narrative, attacking causality and coherence. So we can see that attack on causality in a few different ways. The opening sequence is a kind of prologue where we start with this male figure, who's actually played by Luis Bunuel, who has a barber's blade in his hands and he's sharpening it. He steps outside onto his balcony. He looks up, we cut to a shot of the moon, and then suddenly we cut to a shot of a close-up of a woman's face with a man's hand holding her eye open. This is probably the most famous shot from the entire film. But I think it's important to note something banal but true about this. We got a wide shot of his balcony, which you can see here, but there was no woman there. The woman suddenly appears out of thin air, out of nowhere. Not only that, We also can't really be sure if it's the barber who is grasping this woman's eye. After all, in the wide shot, he doesn't have a necktie. In the close-up, he does. In the subsequent shots, we go from the man, or a man, with his blade, about to draw it across the woman's eye. Then we cut to the moon, a sort of graphic match, where the cloud slices across the moon. And then we cut to a blade actually slicing across an eye. In this case, it's actually a close-up of a dead animal's eye, but it's supposed to be continuous with the woman's face. So you can see here that this opening prologue thwarts a causal relationship between events. A woman suddenly appears. I don't know why this man is cutting her eye. Those causal relationships between events, which we look for in narrative film, are absent. Instead, what seems to matter is a kind of juxtaposition or association between these two different images. Images that are violent and images that might be symbolic, slicing an eye and a cloud slicing a moon. We get a similar absence of causation when, immediately after we get that sliced eye shot, we get an intertitle saying 8 years later, and then we see the same woman, or at least the same actress. We get a look at her eyeballs and she's completely fine. It's confirmed in some way that these chronological markers are meaningless, or if they are meaningful, they're not giving us the kind of causal narrative meaning that they usually do in conventional films. So what we have here in this privileging of unexpected juxtapositions is once again a testament to an aesthetic characteristic of surrealism that often reveled in unexpected juxtapositions. Of course, we also have elements that shock or surprise. This film is full of shockingly violent and shockingly sexual imagery. It's something that the surrealists associated with the stuff that was repressed by civilization, that was dwelling in the unconscious, repressed sexual desires and violent motives. We see this interest in juxtaposition over causation in another famous moment from the film. The man and the woman stare at his hand. His hand has ants crawling from the middle of it. And then we get this series of dissolves that are motivated graphically rather than logically. The hand, which has a kind of dark pit in the middle, dissolves to an armpit. That image becomes a kind of sea urchin on the sand, which has a similar kind of graphical shape. And that image, which has a kind of circle, gives way to a circular iris composition of a person poking at a disembodied hand on the floor. There is a kind of reasoning that brings these objects together, but that reasoning is primarily graphical and has nothing to do with narrative or causation. Finally, let's talk about the way this film uses a kind of dream logic. Louis Bunuel said the plot does not attempt to recount a dream, although it profits by a mechanism analogous to that of dreams. So in other words, the film is not a rendering of a dream that Bunuel had, even though one of the images he said he got from a dream, but the way that it proceeds as a series of events has a kind of logic that is analogous to that of dreams. What might he mean by that? Well, one aspect of dream logic that I think is helpful for understanding how this film works is a sense of abrupt changes in time, place, and action. Think about some of the norms that guide your dreams. Most people will testify to a similar experience when they dream, which is that they will be in one kind of situation or space, and then they will suddenly find themselves in another situation or space. But they won't have a logical reason to explain how they got from one place to another.
Let me ask you a question. You never really remember the beginning of a dream, do you? You always wind up right in the middle of what's going on.
I guess, yeah.
So how did we end up here?
Well, we just came from the,
Think about it, Ariadne. How did you get here?
A similar kind of non-causal change can happen with people or objects. An object can suddenly turn into another object. Or a person can suddenly turn into another person. Or in some sense be something that they're not. So one question that I think is useful to ask of this film to get a sense of its dream logic is to ask, how did we get here? Or how did this one situation emerge? For instance, in the beginning of the film, the woman sees the man riding his bicycle. He crashes his bicycle. She looks and sees this. She goes downstairs to tend to him. Then she finds herself in her apartment once again. But the man is not there. Instead, she's lying out his clothes on her bed. And this is an action that she's more or less absorbed in. And as an audience, we've sort of forgotten about the man altogether. And then suddenly we get a close-up where she looks screen right, and the man is there. He seems to emerge out of thin air. And she's not bothered by this. It seems completely natural. Or consider the moment that I talked about earlier. The woman walks over to the man, finds that he's staring at his hand. She notices that there are ants crawling from his hand. We get a series of cross dissolves that are purely graphically linked until we happen upon a strange scene in which a person on a street is poking at a disembodied hand on the floor. It seems to be a new character, a new human figure, and a new situation. How did we get here? Suddenly we realize through a cut to a window where we have the woman and the man staring down is that these two spaces are actually linked. So the film will willingly depart from its narrative trajectory without any rhyme or reason, but it will equally bring us back. Or consider this moment. This is in the middle of the film where the man is aggressively pursuing the woman. He looks down. He sees something. He bends down. He grabs what seems to be two ropes, but then he looks behind him. What else is he dragging? We cut to a wide shot. It turns out that he's dragging two pianos with two dead donkeys on them, with two priests in tow. There's a sense in which objects will just suddenly emerge in spaces, in a way that violates the laws of physics, but which doesn't violate the laws of how events proceed in dreams. And frankly, in a way that doesn't violate the way in which objects can appear in film, which is compiled through editing. Or take another moment. In the man's violent and aggressive pursuit of the woman, he gets his hand caught in the door. We get a close-up shot of the woman. She looks screen right. We get an eyeline match to that very same man. How is it that the man has his hand caught on the other side of the door and yet is in this room lying on the bed? This is not something that the film dwells on, nor is it something that the woman is overwhelmingly shocked by. Or this. The woman wants to get away from the man. She approaches the door. She opens the door. She looks forward, we get an eyeline match to what she's looking at, and suddenly she's on a beach. How is it that our apartment is both sitting on the beach as well as on the second or third story of an apartment building? So the film rather loosely and confidently gives us these impossible situations. Situations that seem natural to a dream state, but are otherwise unnatural to real life, and unnatural to the way that life is often portrayed in Hollywood conventions. And it's important to note that none of these strange happenings are the result of dream sequences. Bunuel and Thompson will say, an impressionist film would motivate such events, that is, such wild and impossible and bizarre events, as a character's dreams or hallucinations, but in these films, character psychology can't be determined. Linda Williams will say something similar. She says in Un Chien Andalou and L'Âge d'Or, the subsequent film that Dali and Bunuel would make together, these films do not resort to the usual devices of dream sequences or subjective fantasies, devices that ultimately preserve the supreme fiction of the unity of the self, even while giving access to its partial fracturings. In other words, Williams and Bunuel and Thompson are reminding us that in the 1920s, it was a major advance in the French Impressionist and German Expressionist film movements to depict hallucinations, dreams, and other kinds of subjective states. But those films had a tendency, especially in the French Impressionist tradition, to delimit a clear boundary between reality and dream, or reality and hallucination. In Surrealist film and in Un Chien Andalou, the entire film is a dream or a hallucination. It works like a dream. It is not the representation of a dream, it works like a dream. And another aspect of this dream logic is that characters have an unchecked belief in the reality of their dream world. Linda Williams put this really well. She says, what happens in Un Chien Andalou is a very peculiar and paradoxical phenomenon. The surrealist goal with respect to the cinematic signifier is to approximate as closely as possible the dreamer's belief in the reality of the signifier, a signifier that the dreamer thinks is perceived but is really only imagined. To put this in simpler terms, when you're dreaming and you're seeing all kinds of impossible stuff that could never happen in real life, you accept it, you believe it.
Well, dreams, they feel real while we're in them, right? It's only when we wake up that we realize something was actually strange.
Rarely do you question the reality or the believability of what you're seeing. And what's incredibly strange about surrealist cinema is that the characters in these bizarre situations simply accept the reality that they're given. They move through it. They rarely stop and process the status of what they're seeing, just as we rarely stop and process the impossibilities that we encounter in dream worlds. So these are some of the ways I think we can understand surrealist cinema. It's anti-narrative rather than non-narrative, and it uses a kind of dream logic. The last question I want to ask is a brief one. But what does it all mean? Luis Bunuel famously said about this film that nothing in the film symbolizes anything. And this is something that a lot of commentaries on the film will often echo. Don't try to make symbolic meaning of any of this because the filmmakers didn't intend it. But this is not the whole quote. Bunuel also said, following this, the only method of investigation of the symbols would be perhaps psychoanalysis. So remember that one of the core characteristics of surrealism as a movement is its connection to Freudian psychoanalysis and an interest in the unconscious. And it's certainly the case that if you're interested in Freudian psychoanalysis, this film offers a number of seemingly potent symbols that are going to work for that analysis. One film scholar usefully says this about drawing meaning from the film in this way. He says, a typical psychoanalytic interpretation of Un Chien Andalou will usually start by positing a general principle of coherence in function of which the symbols are organized, such as, say, the portrayal of adolescent sexual development or a symbolic portrayal of themes of sexual frustration. One of the cornerstones of Freudian psychoanalysis is the predominance of sexuality as an explanation for many human motivations, desires, and fears. So that same author will briefly go through a number of events or objects from the film and give us an offhand interpretation in a Freudian manner. So he'll say, the film begins with an invocation of the castration complex or perhaps the sexual act. That is, the prologue in which a man slices a woman's eye might be read in a couple ways. It might be read as a symbol of penetrative sex, or it might be read as a symptom of a fear of castration. If you want to know more about the castration complex, you can check out a link below in another video I've made on the topic. Or you might say the hero's striped box is a feminine symbol that could be indicative of a mother fixation. Freudian analysis often looks at particular objects and associates them with male and female sex organs. Containers, boxes, and hollow spaces often symbolize the female body, having a womb-like quality. And this box is indeed a recurring object throughout the film, a motif. The scholar continues, the donkey-laden pianos with their melons and priests are symbols of inhibitions in the superego that, with the castration complex, prevent the cyclist, that is the male hero, from finding normal expression of his sexuality. So that moment when he's trying to aggressively pursue the woman, but he's hampered down by these very heavy things, those things including pianos and priests, well, that might be a good symbol of the superego. The superego is the part of our subjectivity that follows rules, that is civilized, that keeps us from acting out on our violent and sexual urges. So this makes a kind of sense. And he says the lovers buried in the sand, surrounded by insects, would finally show the obsessive omnipotence of desire and its fundamental lack of satisfaction. The film does indeed end not with the woman and her new man, but rather the woman and the original male hero dead in the sand, kind of decaying with insects on them. So it's important to know that this author offers these interpretations not because he believes in them, but because the film only teases us with these images that seem so right for Freudian interpretation. However, he says the importance of these symbols is not that they express some latent psychic reality, but rather that they are posited in a self-conscious way as the elements of a filmic discourse. In other words, for this particular scholar, he thinks the point of the film is to ridicule everything. It ridicules and attacks Hollywood narrative conventions, it ridicules and attacks avant-garde conventions, and it ridicules and attacks a kind of simplified version of Freudian psychoanalysis, or maybe even a simplified version of surrealist art. Though I don't exactly share this position, I end with it because it affirms some of the ambitions of this film. How overall, the film was trying to antagonize not meaning in general, but certain conventions of finding meaning. And yet, ironically or paradoxically, the film is one of the most written about films in film history, and there's no shortage of interpretations on it. So I think I'll end there. That's it for our examination of Un Chien Andalou, and I'll see you next time.